Okay, so welcome back. In this next section, we'll be talking about challenging dynamics and how you as a facilitator might respond or at least think about responding to them. Next slide, please. So we'll go over 5 challenging dynamics. These, of course, are not going to be comprehensive. We try to sort of categorize as many common dynamics that happen in sort of dialogues around diversity and inclusion in this space, but there might be things that fall outside of these. The ones that we've identified are centering the dominant group, toxic positivity, intellectualizing, distancing behaviors, and deficit thinking. And we'll talk through each of these, what they look like in real time, and then what are our recommended approaches for how to respond. But I do want to say up front that the most important thing to know about these dynamics are that it's not about trying to prevent them from happening or having the perfect skills to be able to respond perfectly every single time. As we talked about earlier in the video, being a facilitator is really about being present. And so sometimes it's going to take you a while to observe and notice that the dynamic that you're observing is actually happening. The most important thing is knowing that they could happen and already having some ideas sort of in your tool belt to think through how you might want to respond or how you might want to shift the energy in the group. And the challenging thing about all of these is that they create barriers for the things that we need to actually be successful in dialogue. So like trust, vulnerability, a willingness to grow. So if any of these challenging dynamics are not just happening once, but happening in a pattern, then it can be really, really hard to actually grow some of those pieces around vulnerability, especially. Next slide, please. So the first challenging dynamic that we'll talk about is centering the dominant group. And this one is sort of overarching for the next couple of dynamics, and because it's very deeply embedded in the ways that we're sort of used to being in classrooms, right? So the dominant group is typically what, the traditional classroom has been structured around. And so even if we're trying to challenge that, it can feel almost natural to continue to center the dominant group. And so what I mean by centering is just that when you have decisions to make about the class, how to respond to people, whose voices you sort of take most seriously or you incorporate into thinking about where the class should go next, making all of those decisions around folks that are in the most dominant group. So that can be a combination of being white, being English speaking, being male or masculine presenting, being cisgendered, so a number of different, sort of dominant identities, making those decisions about the class and really only considering the feelings and the needs and the growth of those students is what we mean by centering the dominant group. An example of this might be, for instance, not deciding to cover content that might be actually quite essential to the topic that you're covering, because it might make some students feel guilty, because it might make white students feel guilty. Another example could be, and I think this happens a lot in dialogue spaces, is that, we talk a lot about sort of embracing your emotions or being able to bring feelings into the classroom. But when those feelings are coming from marginalized students, and they might make other people uncomfortable because, they might feel guilty or they might, just feel defensive, sort of expecting marginalized students to manage those feelings or to repress those feelings, whether you're saying that explicitly or implicitly, for the sake of the other folks in the classroom who are more part of the dominant groups. That's what we mean by centering the dominant group, right? So not taking into consideration the different ways that we need to be meeting people's needs and only thinking through or thinking about centering the folks who sort of are already centered in the way that classrooms are structured. And I want to add here that there's a tricky piece around, especially if we're talking about, sort of social change or social justice. Sometimes we think that the folks who are in the dominant group are the people who need the most growth, or who need the most education, or who need to learn the most. And so then we sort of gear a lot of that, a lot of the challenge around them. So trying to make sure that they're getting challenged, trying to make sure that they're, learning about a community that they're not a part of. And where that can really become problematic is if you don't offer those same challenges or those same learning opportunities to the students who are marginalized in the room. Just because you're marginalized doesn't mean that you know everything about what it means to be in that positionality. And so we also have to be offering those kinds of challenges and thinking about what do the marginalized students need in order to be able to grow in this space. I do want to pause here to ask my colleagues if there are any examples that you might have of sort of witnessing how centering the dominant group could happen in a classroom or in the dialogue space.
Yeah, I think one thing that this makes me think of is oftentimes, like, for example, if you're discussing racism, white students will have a lot of questions about like, oh, blah, 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 like, how does this, this isn't my fault, how does this affect me, what can I do about it? And then oftentimes a dynamic that happens is teachers or facilitators get kind of uncomfortable, and they don't quite want to challenge the white students, so they back off. And then students of color feel the need to speak up and like become the teachers and be like, oh, well, you can do this about racism and it's bad because of this. And then that really puts students of color in a position where, well, they're managing and repressing their emotions about what the white students are saying, but also that since they're acting as the teacher, they don't have the space and time to learn on their own.
Yeah, and I think for me, an example that I've seen commonly in the classroom dynamic is sometimes there's like a heavy use of ableist language, there's a lot of things that are said and might be like common terminology that a lot of people use. And sometimes if a student is to speak up on that, a student with a disability, it sometimes goes into a place of like, well, can you explain why this word, or like, I didn't know this word was rooted in that. Like, can you share more about how it makes you feel? And I think that it's actually really important just to center that a student was like having a concern with something, and that if we are truly to like encompass everybody and think through everybody in the classroom dynamic, it shouldn't always fall on the concerns that one particular student is bringing up to then be the spokesperson for all of the people who might also be having problems with the dynamics that are playing out in the classroom.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate you bringing in ableism, Maya. I was thinking about that as I was going through the examples too. When we talk about sort of making accommodations for students, or I think that there ends up being a lot of conversation around disability and ability that doesn't actually include people who have disabilities, right? So it's a lot of able-bodied people sort of thinking through or theorizing about what disability means. And so when people do sort of speak up about a certain dynamic is challenging for them, or they might need a certain accommodation, it becomes all about that individual person, right? Rather than thinking about how the issues that they're talking about might actually be happening for lots of people in the classrooms, right? And so, I don't know, there's a lot, I think, to say around centering the needs and the experiences of able-bodied people here. And then I also think that there's something about across all identities, there becomes something around like centering, even if you're not centering people who are in the dominant group, centering marginalized people who are in closest proximity or who are sort of behaving in a way that is reflective of the dominant group. So I definitely have had a lot of experience of Black students talking about, feeling like they act too Black in the class, or their response is too emotional or too radical or something like that in the class. And so even if you're not, sort of visually saying like, well, the Black students, their needs are not important to me, or implying that you can be centering the Black students who are acting in a way that is more reflective of the dominant group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And I think it's just like a plain word that I've heard a lot in like D&I spaces. It's just like tokenism is like the word that like typically describes that. And so it is kind of doing exactly what you said. And I think that especially as we're in this age of COVID-19, it becomes really important. I think a lot of professors have kind of seen that in meeting the demands of students to make the classroom like more accessible or more able, like changing their curriculum to be reflective of like the COVID-19, referencing a lot of the civil unrest that's happening right now. I think it's important to continue to think through these topics throughout, because what it really is going to do is enrich the classroom environment and allow you as a facilitator to kind of be able to make sure that you're really challenging students. And I mean, that's what we're all here for, is to be learning and growing. And again, just referencing back to the previous module of kind of stepping outside of your comfort zone. And we can't do that if certain populations are coddled or certain populations are not able to fully like sit in and wrestle with the challenging things that might happen in a classroom dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. So as we move forward into the next dynamic, thinking about distancing. Next slide, please. So distancing is, again, what it sounds like. So these are ways that people have of trying to create distance within the classroom. And the reasons why why folks might want to create distance are definitely multifaceted. But what this might look like is, sort of shutting down in the conversation, or finding ways to sort of be responsive without saying very much, or like to sort of do the bare minimum, right? This can also be ways of, especially for folks in the dominant group, to kind of jump out of the conversation or try to sort of side, I'm trying to think of the what's the right word, like sort of find an escape route from the conversation, because I think doing dialogue involves a lot of vulnerability, a lot of emotional work. And so if folks are not willing to do that emotional work, they can find ways to participate, but that are not actually doing like that work and exercising that muscle. So an example of this might be, and I've heard this a lot, students talking about how, sort of diversity doesn't apply to me, racism doesn't apply to me. Talking about, I remember I did a dialogue on sexual identity, and a lot of people sort of had this ethos of like, well, love is love, or we accept, I feel like our generation accepts LGBT people. And that becomes, and it might be a genuine sentiment, but it also becomes a way to kind of stop any nuance in the conversation, or to sort of put yourself in this mode of like, I'm innocent, I don't have to do work around this. And that can be really hard, because then where does the dialogue go from there, right? The other way that this can look, and I've seen this a lot in particular with white men in dialogue spaces, just to be totally honest, right, is talking about how dominant groups can remain silent. So they'll be there, right, but they're not really talking, or their body language is very closed off. And I think sometimes this happens because folks in the dominant group feel like maybe they shouldn't speak on a certain topic, or they shouldn't contribute, or they don't want to take up too much space. But then the question is, how can you really have a dialogue when there's certain people who are just, essentially not participating or not fully present? And then I also think that it can be a little bit of a cop-out, right? Of, oh, I don't want to take up any space, and so I don't want to take up too much space, so I don't take up any space at all. And there has to be a certain level of expectation that everyone is challenging themselves to contribute to the best of their ability. So the recommended approach for this is, I think, first of all, to try to name it when you're noticing distancing behaviors. And then the second piece is to definitely invite students into the process of noticing and making sense of the behaviors that they might be experiencing. So the approach that we have here is to give students the opportunity to share what they're observing about the dynamics in the room. So one way that I've done this in the past is like at the end of a class, if there's a lot of silence, or if it feels like there's a lot of dancing around a topic and we can't quite actually get to what people are feeling or their actual thoughts or views. And there's a lot of sort of like trying to move, rush through the conversation or move forward in the conversation without actually engaging it. At the end, just sharing some of my observations, or asking other folks, like, what did you notice about the conversation today? What was great? What was difficult? And just having a little bit of time to actually let that distancing behavior become information in the dialogue that can then be incorporated in the conversation.
Yeah, I want to just jump in really quick. I think I've seen this a lot in some of the previous work that I've done, where I was helping to facilitate a workshop where the participants were mostly white students. And one thing that we noticed and even planned for when we were like preparing the workshop is we would show this video about redlining about halfway through. And after the video was done, you know, we'd go around and, you know, say, oh, you know, what did people think about the video, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of the times the white students would just be like, oh, you know, I didn't know that before. Or they'd be like, oh, I did know that before. And like, you know, I can see how it affects my life because my neighborhood was mostly white growing up. But then that's all they would say. And so we'd be like, oh, well, you know, how does that make you feel? What other thoughts do you have on that? And they would really just kind of clam up. And yeah, we did a kind of similar thing to kind of counter that, where we'd be like, okay, like we noticed that everyone's being silent. Like, why is that? You know, is everyone still thinking about the video? You know, are people uncomfortable with, you know, what the video was talking about? Like, how are people feeling right now? Are you uncomfortable? Are you thoughtful? Are you just tired? Like, and so we, you know, name that dynamic and put it out there, and then people would maybe not fully get back into the conversation, but at least start, you know, to be like, oh yeah, like that was a lot of information and I'm, you know, still trying to process it. Or, you know, I feel kind of overwhelmed because like I knew about that before, but I don't know what I can do because it's like such a systemic thing with like a long history. And so then that would kind of restart the conversation about what people were actually thinking and feeling.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think something that stuck out to me as you were going through these slides, Sika, was that some of these dynamics of distancing can be way more subtle than you might originally think. And so I think another example of distancing is also just like if there are spaces, especially as like I'm a public health student. And so public health as a major tends to be a lot of cis women centered space. And so a lot of times it could be not that there's actually silence, but more so it's like the men will be like, well, I see that the women seem to really be bonding over this idea. And so I'm going to let them continue to talk about it. Or it can be that if you're in a space where just any of the numerous identities, like the Black students seem to really be bonding over this. The queer students seem to really be bonding over this. And so as that, it's kind of like acknowledging that you maybe are in the majority group typically, and so you're trying to step back. But I think that it is also really important to still be involved in those conversations. And so I really appreciate kind of the temp checks that you guys both mentioned in terms of addressing kind of the dynamics at large.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maya. And that definitely is how I've seen it show up in dialogue, right? Where it's like, well, they're talking about it, so I can kind of take a back seat, and that really stalls the conversation and also just leaves out, you know, not that having a diversity of perspectives is the primary goal, but I do think that it teaches people that, you know, that basically you don't have a responsibility to participate or to support the conversation or contribute to the conversation. I also wanted to add a little bit of a caveat here that I'm just thinking of now, thinking about how marginalized students can also exhibit distancing behaviors, but I think they tend to be for different reasons or with sort of a different goal in mind. And so going back to what Adam had shared about just asking people, you know, I'm noticing that there's a lot of silence, or I'm noticing that we keep hearing from these people and it seems like, you know, these folks have a lot of energy, but not as much from everyone else. And being genuinely curious about what's going on for people can be really helpful, because you don't want people to feel like, you know, just because they're silent means that they're doing something bad, because that's not true, right? That's definitely not true. But you do want to maybe give some permission or model for people that when you're being silent, to at least be reflective for themselves, like, well, I notice that I'm being really silent, or I notice that I'm taking a back seat here. Is that what I want to be doing? Is there a reason behind that? So kind of like, again, walking with them through being in the process of dialogue also includes giving them some tools for thinking about how their behaviors might be distancing and what the reasons are. Next slide, please. So the next one is something that I think people, especially in higher education, talk about a lot, but I don't know if people challenge it that much when it comes to talking about social justice, because it's the way that we've been socialized to think a lot about sort of oppression or about issues. So, and that's deficit thinking. So a really simple definition of deficit thinking would be to sort of attribute negative outcomes or attributes to a group that faces some form of, sort of negative impacts, right? But rather than focusing on why those negative impacts are happening, you attribute those, the sort of negative part or the deficit to the group itself. So an example of this might be, I think this happens a lot around sort of health disparities or poverty, or sort of, being quote unquote at risk, and talking about how communities of color experience greater amount of disparities, but not really questioning, well, if we're talking about health disparities, what framework of health are we using? If we're talking about poverty, why is there poverty? Like thinking about how the structures and systems that are in place have actually caused those disparities, as opposed to just thinking of, Black folks or brown folks as inherently victimized all the time, because that's not necessarily true. The second, and a second example of this might be using statistics to describe violence against trans women without talking about cisgender people who perpetuate that violence, right? So again, it's focusing a lot on the outcome and sort of talking about, well, why does this happen and what can we do to help? And it really puts a certain group into this position of sort of victim or not being able to have self-determination about their own, issues that their communities might be facing or their own experiences, in totally taking the power dynamic out, right? Because violence doesn't just happen, oppression doesn't just happen, people are violent. People do, sort of participate in oppression. And so it's a really, really important thing to really observe in dialogue, because I think sometimes we get really caught up in talking about a certain issue and we're talking about, and I think people get really deep into their guilt, or they start feeling very sad for certain communities, or I didn't know that this happened and it makes me feel more grateful about where I am. And all of those things are valid, but there has to be that question of, I noticed that we keep talking about this in this sort of deficit lens. Is there another way to think about this? Is there a power dynamic that we might be missing? So I'll pause there to once again invite in colleagues to think about, have you seen deficit thinking in your classes or in a dialogue space?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. This is one that I struggle with a bit more in handling, but I've definitely seen students, say things. I remember one time in that workshop that I was actually talking about earlier, we were talking about communities of color, and a student said something along the lines of like, communities of color are poor because they have more crime. And so it was like, talking about like, it was almost like a twisted version of like, poor people are poor because they're lazy. And, like, it was very much blaming the results and the outcomes on the behavior of the people, when we literally just had watched that video about like redlining and systemic racist housing policy. And yeah, I feel like it's really important to kind of get to the but why, like what's causing this to happen. Remember we were just seeing, but at the same time, it's something that I'm still definitely working on, because it can be kind of hard when someone, and I mean, not to jump ahead, but also when someone takes like feelings and then just starts throwing out statistics, or like, with like intellectualizing, being like, oh, well, what, like logically we know that this is the case because blah, 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 blah. But yeah, I think it's definitely an important dynamic to interrupt.
Yeah, and for me, I think I'm really just reflecting on how deficit thinking can be used kind of as a tool of white supremacy. And I know that that might sound like a big word or like a large thing, but I think what I'm hearing shared from both Adam and Sika is that a lot of the time this is happening around issues that are systemic. And so when we are choosing to deflect from talking about the systemic nature of these things, then we then start to make it about individuals. And that's how we end up with situations of like Trayvon Martin and like he shouldn't have been wearing that hoodie and like all of these different things that are really like blaming people for their individual attributes as opposed to looking at the systemic issues. And so I challenge us all as we're in these spaces where we are growing as facilitators, and again where we as students like myself might be like in a place of like really wanting to learn. I challenge us all to kind of think about that and think about the ways that we are being resistant to talking about systemic level changes and also are contributing to like the victim narrative that might not be true, or not might not, is definitely not true.
Yeah, thank you. And I thank you for sort of zooming out and thinking about how it's a part of white supremacy, to really only be thinking about deficits in this way. I definitely want to move into the next couple of challenging dynamics just in the interest of time. But the last piece that I'll say about deficit thinking is that it's so crucial it can be hard to think about, oh, how do you respond to this like in the moment in dialogue. It's more about how the class is structured or how people are thinking. But I also want people to think about the ways that students sometimes get invited into the conversation is really based on deficit thinking, right? So being expected to talk about, oh, well, I am, I'm gay. And so talking about all of the challenges of being gay and the things that, like, there's sort of this expectation that your participation in the dialogue should be directly connected to your trauma or your, like, the worst negative experiences. And I think that really does a disservice to students who, again, students who are of more marginalized identities, who actually need to be learning not only about how to make sense of their experiences, but how to make sense of their lives in the context of their sort of positionality in systems, right? And not just thinking about, gosh, my community has it really bad. We don't want the conversation to end there. So the recommended approach here is to, when you notice that it's happening, talk about deficit thinking. I think it's really important to give this term to students. And then basically to use the language of Brittany Cooper, ask more and better questions, right? Be asking why. What are we missing? What causes us to even think about it or talk about it in this way? So moving forward, I'll pass it on to Maya to take us into intellectualizing.
Yeah, so I would just like to kind of walk us through how intellectualizing things can also be a challenging dynamic. And so what it is it's basically a lot of times when we're in these educational spaces, we tend to kind of stay in like the head space or to really just think through things in like the terms of like statistics and facts. And so when we do this, we make impacts that are felt physically and emotionally into hypotheticals. And so some examples of this are if someone is kind of talking about something, you respond with statistics and kind of citations, or like ask them to like cite their sources or show you where they got that or what article they read or what podcast they listened to. And so it can also include like focusing on students that are using like the right language. And so if like students were asked to read like a text or an article or something like that, and then they're discussing it in a way that is feeling very like personal or emotional, or maybe they're bringing like outside examples into it, and then you keep drawing it back to the text or drawing it back to experiences that are maybe not listed in the text. I think that that is all part of intellectualizing. And so the reason why we're choosing to focus on this is just because when we're thinking about, again, power, which we've talked about continuously throughout this, it's very important to kind of think through like who has the power and how are we making it accessible for everyone to engage. And some of the topics that we might be covering in our lesson plans or in dialogues or whatever we're kind of facilitating, some of the topics might be hard for students to immediately engage in, and they might often start from a place of like the emotional and like directly what they're feeling, and then after they kind of have some of those emotions out, can pull back in some of the readings and text. But if we're immediately shutting out those reflections and those emotions, it's really hindering students' ability to learn, to engage with the material in the way that feels right for them. And so I'll open it up and see if anyone has any other examples.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that intellectualizing happens a lot, of course, in classrooms, and so I think it's important to go back to the piece from the beginning around really grounding yourself in purpose. Is the purpose that students are able to recite back the definition of intersectionality, or is the purpose that they're able to recognize when discrimination is happening intersectionally out in the world? And so shifting our focus from like the content and making sure that they get it in the ways that we have been taught to think or to read or whatever, and really remembering that this is about people's lives and people sort of building skills that they hopefully will use in the real world. So I think that piece about what is the purpose of us being here is really, really important. And I think if we're intellectualizing or making things into these abstract, hypothetical issues, we miss the real people in the room.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, one thing I just wanted to add in is I often see students from dominant groups using intellectualizing as kind of like a gut reaction. To protect their comfort when they would otherwise be empathizing with people in marginalized groups. So like if they're reading about like, let's say just like an article about the experiences of someone who's marginalized, then there's kind of this gut reaction of like, oh, and it ties in closely to deficit thinking like I was just talking about in the previous slide, where it's like, oh, but they deserve it because of this statistic that I remember from something else that I read. And so I think it's really important to challenge students to really, stop themselves when that happens and, back up and think about, why am I defaulting to this? And, why is my, default reaction to not empathize with this person, but try to rationalize away the real issue?
Yeah, thank you both for kind of naming that and digging a little deeper into it. And so before moving onto some of the other dynamics, I just want to offer some recommended approaches and kind of addressing this should you encounter it as a facilitator or someone who's leading a dialogue. And so I think it's really important to kind of invite the more sharing of personal experiences. And so this can look like asking feeling questions. So maybe if there's a specific reading, you can start with kind of saying like, how did this make you feel? What stood out as you were reading this? What was maybe new information that you gained? And really starting from that feeling place will help people to kind of start to unpack some of like what maybe was challenging for them and what maybe they have more work to learn on. And so that's really a good starting place. Another thing to do is to kind of just slow down and sit with the resistance, and also be able to like name that facilitating is always going to be messy. The dynamics can be messy, things can be complicated, and that can be on the part of the facilitator who is maybe struggling to kind of hold all the nuance of that, but it also happens on the part of the student in terms of what they choose to share, how they share it, and making sure that it is something that students can understand. And so when we're constantly staying in this space of intellectualizing, that also applies into like how a student chooses to share things out. And so sometimes a student might really just want to say something short and simple, but intellectualizing then makes it so that the student feels the need to expand or say it in a way that is like perfectly like thought out. And I think that sometimes those thoughts might come to you half-baked, and that's totally okay. And still just as valuable if a student is still kind of processing through that and maybe has started at a place of emotion. And so the next dynamic that we're going to talk about is similar to intellectualizing. We're going to be talking about toxic positivity. And so what happens with toxic positivity is sometimes with intellectualizing, there's kind of an urge to stay in like the heady space. But with toxic positivity, there can also be tendencies to move into like a body space, but in a way that's not actually furthering the conversation. And so with toxic positivity, we are talking about using positive attitudes about difference, inclusion, or acceptance to shut down what we might feel uncomfortable or unresolved about. And so with that, I think basically toxic positivity, some examples of that can include like, I was brought up to accept everyone, or I mean, even our dean put out a Black Lives Matter statement. Doesn't that count for something? And so those are two examples, and I'll add in a third just in case it's still not clicking. I think that another example of toxic positivity can be if you are in a space where there's like a lot of like multicultural or different identities like based on race. And so it can be like, oh, well, I treat everyone the same. I don't see color. And so with that, what it's actually doing is any nuances or differences that could be present are getting kind of like solidified down into a monolith of like all the people being the same. And so I think it challenges the ability for the conversation to go in new directions based on what people are saying. And I also think just in terms of like an equity lens versus an equality lens, I think that when we focus on toxic positivity, it kind of doesn't allow us to get into that place of people having different needs and having different experiences and bringing those into the classroom or facilitation space. And so it's really important that as we're thinking through different dynamics and things, that we're not operating from that equity lens or that equality lens where everyone is the same and we're all like not seeing color and we're all accepting everyone and respecting everyone. And I think this touches a little bit on previous pieces that we have said of like really getting into the nuances of like, what does respect look like? What would it truly mean to like accept everybody? And I think the reality is that that is not true. And also if you're accepting everybody in the same way, there's bound to be some people that are left out. And so with that, I think it's just really important to kind of think through whatever resistance you might be having or like what is allowing you to not dig deeper beyond the like acceptance of everyone. But I'll open it up in case my colleagues have anything to say.
Yeah, I think toxic positivity is something that I especially have noticed, and I think more people are starting to be aware of after the COVID-19 pandemic, where, you know, suddenly we're thrown into this really challenging situation. And, you know, the impulse for a lot of people was to be like, this is great. There's still a silver lining. You know, there's still lessons to be learned, which maybe there are. But I think only focusing there really shuts down people being able to actually process and move through some of the difficulties or some of the challenges that they might be facing. And I think it really distracts us from being able to fully sit with what is actually going on for people, even if it's not affecting us, right? So when we think about, you know, with the current sort of social uprisings around anti-racism, you know, I've heard a lot of folks want to go into this direction of like, well, we're talking about it, right? At least we're having a conversation. At least, you know, people are saying anti-racism. And yes, those things are great, but those things should also not block off the rest of the dialogue about, okay, but what does that actually mean? Or how are people impacted? I think around you know, around ableism or around different kinds of identities that are thought to be like, oh my gosh, that's really challenging to go through that situation. There can be all of this emphasis on, well, how is it positive? How is it good? How is there a lesson? How is it inspirational? Or, you know, things like that. And again, it really just kind of passes us right over thinking about what are the actual impacts? What is the trauma that people might be sitting with? What is the harm that people might be sitting with? And so when we're in a dialogue, I think being able to just note for people or ask questions around like, what is really hard about this conversation? What's hard to accept? Because people usually when they go into toxic positivity, they're not trying to be toxic, right? They're just trying to not have to deal with what might feel overwhelming. And so I think this is really, really good to be able to challenge within yourself, but also to gently meet people where they're at. You know, I noticed that this is hard for you. I noticed that, you know, someone being angry or someone being really harmed around a certain identity. I know that that's hard to sit with. And can we sit with it, right? Can we figure out how we can have a conversation about this without feeling so overwhelmed about what the reality might be?
Yeah, and I think Sika touched on it. So I'll go ahead and move us into the recommended approaches. But I think kind of some of the questions that you asked, Sika, in terms of like, why are we still sitting in this place? Why are we not able to like move deeper, move further in this? I think it's important to like invite that curiosity into the space and think about the different perspectives and perceptions of kind of what's going on. And so I think a common thing that I've noticed across all of these is just that it's okay to notice the dynamics, and it's okay to question the dynamics that you might be observing, and asking like where you might be falling short, or like what dynamics aren't being captured, and really thinking through why that might be happening.
All right, now that we've gone through 5 of the challenging dynamics, we're going to ask you all to take 10 minutes, choose a specific dynamic that you think would stump you the most, or I don't know, gives you the most anxiety, and just take 10 minutes to reflect on these questions. So first, what feelings, thoughts, and anxieties come up for me as I consider this happening in my discussion? Second, how do you see students contributing to this dynamic? How do you think you as the facilitator might contribute to this dynamic? And third, how do you think you would invite students and challenge yourself to redirect the conversation? So we invite you to pause the video now and take 10 minutes to journal or reflect about these questions. Great. So now I think we're just going to have a little conversation about what some of our answers would be to those questions. I know, at least for me, the dynamic that I would choose is deficit thinking. I think that one is definitely the hardest one for me still. And I think the main anxiety that I have around it is not reacting the right way in the moment. And so then, it kind of puts the burden on the marginalized students then to step up and say the correct thing if I'm, like struggling in the moment to be like, oh, but like, let's get to the root of this issue.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of going in between distancing behaviors and intellectualizing. I think when it comes to intellectualizing, I'm a very abstract thinker, like a very big picture kind of thinker. And so sometimes I can really focus in on trying to get people to think about concepts, or trying to, oh, well, I read this really good thing and they talked about this. And that can be helpful, but I also think it takes people out of being sort of grounded in what their actual responses are. So trying to find that balance, right, of like challenging folks intellectually, but also not only leaving it there. And then when it comes to distancing behaviors, I think it's just hard to not take it personally. When you ask the question, or when you're trying to have a really deep conversation and it feels like there's just crickets, or people are just resistant. As a facilitator, that can feel like, oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong? Like, I don't want to force them to contribute. And then, I think there's also this advice that facilitators get a lot of, like, be comfortable with silence. Don't, if silence happens, that doesn't mean that you need to jump in. And so it can be really, really tricky to find, again, that balance. I think here we go with this both and thinking, where on one hand, distancing behaviors are not necessarily a bad thing. You can respond to them and invite them in for a sort of a deeper discussion. And on the other hand, they're really, really challenging when, at least for me, when they happen in real time.
Yeah, thank you for that, both of you. And I think for me, it falls somewhere in between the deficit thinking and the centering dominant groups. I think as a public health student, a lot of conversations that we have are kind of coming from that deficit thinking, of thinking through like, well, this population is disproportionately impacted by this. And in this population having like such the burden of a lot of health disparities, oftentimes that then puts them into the dominant group of kind of being the ones who are struggling with these things and having to deal with that. And so it's kind of like a balance between like, yes, these health disparities exist, and yes, they are like happening on the systemic level, but also like in them happening on a systemic level that is impacting a certain population, that still doesn't mean that this population needs to bear the brunt of talking about how they're oppressed or how this disparity is playing out. And so I think I often find myself struggling between the two of those to kind of be like, well, like, I really believe in like students or like these populations having like a say over like how we're working through the solutions to like better the health or better the education or whatever it might be. And so what does it look like to be thinking through that and moving out of the deficit lens, but also like respecting that like people have their own wisdom and their own education and their own ways of doing things. And I think that is something that I like continue to like struggle through, but also think through as I'm like in like facilitating spaces or like the classroom and I'm thinking through some of these things.
Thank you, Maya. And I think both of you really spoke to how all of these can really blend into each other. I think it's really important not to intellectualize here and focus so much on, oh, okay, well, this dynamic is happening. Is that toxic positivity? Is that distancing behaviors? These are just working categories to be able to talk through the ways that power tends to happen and shift the energy in a dialogue space. So remember that the thing that you really should be noticing is what is the barrier to building trust or to folks' growth or participation or ability to be vulnerable in this class. It doesn't matter as much if you name it in a specific way as much as you are acknowledging that it's happening and finding a way to respond to it, even if you have to respond to it next class after the fact. The purpose here is not to magically make these dynamics disappear, but rather to use these dynamics for the learning of the entire class.
Thank you so much, Shika. That was perfect modeling of kind of pulling us out of that intellectualizing framework. And that's something that you can all feel free to use as you notice your students starting to kind of go down that intellectualizing pathway.
Thanks, Maya. So for the next section, you'll be going into facilitating in a virtual context.